Chapter 3. Power Plant. International Women's Day notwithstanding, the single biggest event scheduled for Viktor Brukhanov and his colleagues and subordinates for the month of March 1986 was an all-union conference of representatives of enterprises that supplied construction materials and hardware for the Chernobyl nuclear plant. The three-day conference, planned for the last week of the month, was intended mainly to coordinate the actions of the plant administrators, the construction directorate, and the vendors, and solve problems that had emerged with the construction of the newest power unit of the plant, reactor number 5. Construction quotas for 1985 had not been met, and the prospects for bringing the reactor on stream in 1986 were dubious. But the Moscow Party Congress had set a goal of more than doubling the construction of nuclear units in the course of the next 5-year plan. In Pripyat, the person with the greatest stake in the success of the conference was Vasyl Kizima, the 54-year-old head of the construction directorate that was charged with building the power plant. As far as power and prestige went in the city of Pripyat, Kizima outshone Brukhanov. Whereas the latter lived in an apartment building, though a prestigious one, Kizima and his family occupied one of 4 cottages built in a city that was supposed to have no cottages at all. When the Ukrainian party boss, Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, visited the site of the power plant in the mid-1970s, he was so impressed with the young director of construction that he ordered his aides to ensure Kizima's election to the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet. That would not only raise Kizima's salary, but also boost his prestige and independence from local party and state officials. In 1984, Kizima was given the highest Soviet award, Hero of Socialist Labor. Brukhanov, despite being elected a delegate to the party congress in Moscow, was still waiting for that kind of recognition. It all made little sense if one looked at the results of the two managers' work, especially their fulfillment of production quotas. Kizima and his crews failed to build any unit of the nuclear power plant on time, while Brukhanov and his engineers invariably fulfilled or overfilled their quotas. The previous year, 1985, was no exception. That year, the 4 units of Brukhanov's power plant produced 29 billion kilowatts of electrical energy, as much as all the power stations of the then united Czechoslovakia, enough to power 30 million Soviet apartments, housing roughly half the Soviet population of 280 million for the whole year. They had overfulfilled their quotas by more than 9%, reported the Pripyat newspaper Tribuna Energetika, Tribune of the Energy Worker, in January 1986. The same issue featured a brief note titled, "Why has the 1985 plan for the nuclear power plant not been fulfilled?" It was not apparent from the title that the article concerned the failure to meet construction quotas. Still, Vasyl Kizima was not only spared public criticism, but also showered with attention from his superiors. There was a simple reason for that. Given the constant shortages of labor and materials, the higher-ups considered the supervision of construction a much more challenging task than that of running the plant itself, and Kizima had shown his ability to do the job better and faster than most of his rivals. A native of the Kiev region, Kizima was born in January 1932 into a peasant family in Tarashcha Rayon, south of the city of Kiev. A rayon is a district similar to a county. He was only 1 year old when the Holodomor, the great Ukrainian famine, struck the region. He was lucky to survive. Every 3rd citizen of the rayon died of hunger. In neighboring Volodarka Rayon, the death toll was even higher. 466 of every 1,000 residents did not live to see the year 1934. The mortality rate was especially high among children and the elderly. Kizima also survived the brutal Nazi occupation of Ukraine from 1941 to 1944. After graduating from the local school, he studied engineering in Kiev and cut his teeth on the construction of coal power plants in western Ukraine. Kizima returned to his home region in 1971 to take charge of the flagging construction of the city of Pripyat and the nuclear plant nearby. From the very start, Kizima told his superiors that there could be only one boss on the construction site. Emissaries from the Kiev ministries could pack their bags and go home. They did so. But in the city itself, Kizima had to share power and prestige with Brukhanov and his people at the plant. While Brukhanov was regarded as competent, but reserved and not very sociable, Kizima combined the expertise and toughness of a construction foreman with the magnetic personality of a politician. Kizima's bosses praised his strategic thinking, but they were somewhat concerned about his canniness. Construction workers considered him one of their own, and his subordinates emphasized his toughness. Brukhanov was respected, but Kizima was either idolized or feared, depending on one's circumstances. Eventually, the two men learned to work together and respect each other. Ultimately, they had a common cause, with the plant administrator being the customer and the construction directorate the vendor, each depending on the other in many ways. Personal relations between the two masters of the city aside, there were also managerial, social, and cultural tensions between their teams. Most of Brukhanov's people were top-notch, highly educated engineers who came mostly from Russia, bringing to Pripyat not only their expertise in running the nuclear plant, but also their big city habits, culture, and occasionally arrogance. The locals who manned Kizima's construction crews were often former villagers with their own habits, culture, and prejudices. The newcomers spoke Russian, the locals largely Ukrainian, with Surjik, a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian, emerging as the lingua franca of Pripyat streets. Managing tensions between the two groups and preventing occasional clashes among local youths and the young construction workers brought to the city by Kizima, known as Rexes, were among the responsibilities and headaches of the Pripyat police. Most challenging were the 2 days when the workers received their pay, first an advance and then the rest of the salary. Celebrating both paydays by getting together and drinking was a long-established Soviet custom. The police took no chances and went after any young men who appeared on the streets in groups of more than 5. It helped only to a degree. In 1985, officials had to deal with a youth riot that resulted in turning over cars and breaking windows. Nuclear power plant workers of all ages were often envied by those who worked in the construction directorate. Their salaries were higher and working conditions better, and they moved from dorms into apartments faster than those who were actually building the apartments. The construction workers believed that the atmosphere at their building sites was better and that their workmates were open and straightforward, whereas those at the plant were canny and calculating. The plant workers generally disagreed. Kizima ran his directorate like a huge peasant household. The heads of the directorate's units dreaded his invitations to the Romashka, one of the plant's dining halls, for a meal of Ukrainian borscht. At the head of the long table, in the spot reserved for the family patriarch, sat Kizima with his children, subordinates, on both sides. All sat silently spooning their borscht when suddenly the quiet was broken by his voice, not angry but decisive and insistent, saying that this group of delivery men had not brought a crane to the building site at the appointed time, or that concrete factory had not completely filled the order of the concrete pouring brigade, recalled a journalist who had been invited to one of Kizima's working lunches. Kizima had a superb memory, and not only knew his numerous subordinates by first name and patronymic, but also remembered in detail all the particularities of their tasks and the resources at their disposal. Kizima was known to be a true patriot of the city, able to find money and resources to construct not only the plant, but also the public buildings, the housing and the infrastructure of Pripyat. He also resisted pressure to build quickly, preferring to build well. When party leaders reprimanded him for slow work on the Pripyat Palace of Culture, he referred to the St. Volodymyr Cathedral in Kiev as an example. The cathedral had taken decades to build, but was still standing, he told a surprised party official, who could hardly imagine a worse ideological sin than that of comparing a socialist palace of culture to a church. Kizima did not mind. He not only took his time, but insisted that the palace he built would be the best in Ukraine. He obtained scarce marble for its walls, aluminium parts, almost impossible to acquire in the USSR, for its infrastructure, and rare varieties of wood for its floors. The crews that installed the wooden floors in the Pripyat Palace of Culture were the same ones that had restored the imperial-era Tsarist palace in Kiev. The construction of Unit 5 at the Chernobyl power plant presented Kizima with a new set of problems. He had built reactors before and figured out how to do so with minimal delays, but now, with the party authorities in Moscow rushing to launch as many reactors as possible, the time frame for the construction of the new unit had been cut from 3 years to 2. Construction had begun in 1985 and was supposed to be finished by the end of 1986. The new all-union Minister of Energy and Electrification, Anatoly Mayorets, who had suggested at the party congress in February 1986 that the timeline for the construction of multi-unit nuclear power plants could and should be cut from 7 years to 5, was eager to make his mark on the industry. In December 1985, Mayorets had come to Pripyat to see for himself what was going on at the construction site. He wanted to speed up the work, which was already falling behind. In his presence, the Kiev Regional Party Committee issued a resolution calling for an uptick in the pace. The party used the main tool at its disposal, a barrage of reprimands to the officials deemed responsible for the delays. Some were oral, others written, and still others recorded in the personal party files of the victims. If those did not work, the official would be fired. If the situation improved, the reprimands would be withdrawn, the manager rewarded, and the game would start again. In January 1986, Pripyat managers became the targets of party reprimands. Among the victims was R.L. Soloviev, Brukhanov's deputy responsible for construction projects, that is, for working with Kizima and his people. At a meeting of the Pripyat City Party Committee, Soloviev was issued a reprimand of the severest kind. It was recorded in his party file. Kizima and his deputies were spared, for the time being. Kizima was a rarity among Soviet officials in unhesitatingly opposing party officials who wanted him to divert scarce resources from the plant he was building and the city he adored to anything other than the purposes for which they were intended. Ever since the forcible collectivization of farms in the Stalin era, agriculture as a sector of the Soviet economy had been chronically lagging. The party, in order to increase production, had resorted to a system of partnerships between large urban industrial and scientific enterprises and collective farms. In practice, that meant sending urbanites to the villages to help with farm work. Party officials in Pripyat demanded that nuclear plant personnel and construction workers do their part, and the local newspaper would regularly report on the results. Brukhanov complained, but he sent his people to the neighbouring collective farms. Kizima, however, simply refused. On one occasion, when a party boss demanded agricultural labour from the nuclear plant personnel, Kizima, red in the face, asked his secretary to connect him with party headquarters in Kiev. "I have your man here in my office," Kizima told the official at the other end of the line. "He is telling me what to do, but my plate is full. Please figure out for yourselves who is boss here, him or me." He hung up the receiver, and that was the end of the matter. Given the importance of nuclear energy, party officials had little choice but to back down. But they were furious. As they saw it, Kizima was getting away with murder. One of Kizima's tools in dealing with the growing party pressure was his use of the media to make sure party officials helped him by insisting that suppliers deliver products to the construction site in a timely fashion. Kizima had learned media tactics long before the era of glasnost, or openness, declared by Mikhail Gorbachev and his reformers. In the spring of 1980, Kizima and Brukhanov were summoned to Moscow to report to the Deputy Prime Minister of the All-Union Government on the construction of the third unit of the power plant. Representatives of other plants attended as well, but none of them were doing worse than Chernobyl. If average fulfillment of construction quotas was approaching 90%, Kizima and Brukhanov reported the fulfillment of only 68% of their quota. The problem was lack of qualified personnel, equipment and supplies. They were ordered to catch up within a month, an impossible task, since they were at least 2 or 3 months behind the original schedule. With the revised deadline in jeopardy, and new reprimands on their way from the very top of the Soviet Party and state pyramid, Kizima invited Oleksandr Bolyasny, a reporter for the regional communist newspaper Kievska Pravda, Kiev Truth, to his office for an interview. The editor-in-chief expected an upbeat report and a pledge that the quotas would be fulfilled in the shortest possible amount of time. Instead, Kizima kept Bolyasny in his reception room for hours, while he himself took pen and paper and personally wrote responses to the interview questions. Kizima explained that the unit would not be finished on time because the requisite supplies simply were not there. Miracles did not happen in the socialist economy. He wanted party officials to put pressure on the vendors and make them fulfill their obligations. The terrified newspaper editor called the party officials, who were not happy, but eventually gave their go-ahead for publication of the interview. After all, it shielded them as well against unjust criticism from Moscow. In early 1986, the problem with the construction of Unit 5 was similar. The construction crews were there, but the supplies were not. With the reduction of the construction cycle, decreed long before similar resolutions were passed by the Party Congress in Moscow, Kizima and his people did not get their design documentation until July 1985. That delayed their orders for construction materials and equipment until the fall, and the vendors began to deliver construction blocks and hardware only at the end of that year. Some arrived on time, but others did not, halting the installation process. When Lyubov Kovalevskaya, a reporter for the Pripyat newspaper Tribuna Energetika, approached Kizima with the idea of publishing a special issue discussing the problems with vendors, he readily agreed. More important, in a violation of security regulations, he gave Kovalevskaya permission to consult data collected by the nuclear plant's computer center on the quantity and quality of hardware supplied by the vendors. That was a major coup for her, but others were less obliging than Kizima. Mindful of the watchful eye of the KGB, the computer center's managers allowed Kovalevskaya to work with printouts of the spreadsheets for only 15 minutes, hoping that Kovalevskaya, a teacher of the Russian language and literature by training, would not be able to understand much of what they contained. She managed to work on the spreadsheets for half an hour, though, taking a lot of notes. The figures that Kovalevskaya copied added up to a terrifying picture. As much as 70% of the hardware supplied by one of the vendors had serious defects. Of the metal structures for the reservoir that would store used nuclear fuel, 356 metric tons, or 392 US tons, had major defects as well. Concrete panels supplied by another vendor were of the wrong size and had to be adjusted on the construction site. But the main problem was that even if some parts were up to specifications, others had not yet arrived. Altogether, 2,435 metric tons, or 2,684 US tons, of metal structures were still missing. Kizima gave his go-ahead for publication of the article, which appeared under Kovalevskaya's pen name, L. Stanislavskaya, in Tribuna Energetika, on Friday, March the 21st, 1986. The all-union meeting of representatives of the suppliers was scheduled to start on the following Monday. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear plant, believed that Kizima's workers were doing a good job of building the plant. They were also very successfully withstanding pressure from party and industry officials, who were making unrealistic demands and setting impossible deadlines. According to Dyatlov, Kizima and his subordinates did not take all those assaults seriously, although that attitude was not on display. Otherwise it would be impossible to survive for long under those working conditions. As far as Dyatlov was concerned, the main problem was not with Kizima, but with the lack of a proper manufacturing base for the construction of nuclear plants, and hence the problems with vendors. Nuclear power stations, like the one in Chernobyl, were no longer the responsibility of Yefim Slavsky, the all-powerful head of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, which was the hub of the Soviet nuclear program and its military-industrial complex. Slavsky's ministry was a virtual empire, a state within a state with its own manufacturing plants, capable of producing most of the equipment needed for the nuclear industry. Those plants had been used to build the nuclear power station at the Sosnovyi Bor settlement near Leningrad, where the first reactor began producing electrical energy in December 1973. But soon after that, the construction of nuclear power stations had become the responsibility of the Ministry of Energy and Electrification, which was not part of the military-industrial complex. It had a poor manufacturing base of its own, and none of the political clout that came with Slavsky's power and prestige. As Dyatlov later recalled, the government resolution indicated that non-standard equipment for the 4 blocks of the first of those stations, numbers 1 and 2, would be produced by the same factories that produced them for the Leningrad station. But the Ministry of Medium Machine Building did not take the government resolution as an order. No prime minister could control Slavsky, whose main responsibility was the Soviet nuclear weapons program. Nuclear power plants like the one in Chernobyl were on their own. They said, "You have your own factories, so go ahead and make the equipment. We'll provide the plans," continued Dyatlov. I had been to several factories making auxiliary equipment for the Ministry of Energy. The machine tools were on the level of poor workshops. Commissioning them to produce equipment for a reactor was like making a carpenter do the work of a joiner, so there was constant difficulty with production for every block. Complaints about difficulties with the construction of the new units were all but ignored at the top. After all, the Chernobyl power plant was assigned reactors of the type that in theory could be built by unspecialized machine-building factories almost anywhere by almost anyone at minimum cost. The Chernobyl plant originally was supposed to use water-water energy reactors, or VVERs, the Soviet equivalent of the pressurized water reactors, or PWRs, in the United States. Like its American counterpart, the Soviet VVER originated in the 1950s as a byproduct of building reactors for nuclear submarines. In those reactors, energy was produced by placing fuel rods, which generate heat through the fission of uranium atoms, into pressurized water. Water is also used as a coolant to prevent the whole system from overheating. The design was extremely safe. In the unlikely event of the failure of coolant circulation, the increased heat would effectively shut down the reaction. The less water there was in the core of the reactor, the smaller the neutron moderation effect, slowing the fast energy neutrons produced by water on the radioactive fuel in the rods, which could not continue the reaction without water. The VVER reactors tested quite well at a number of Soviet nuclear power plants, which was why they were initially chosen for the Chernobyl plant. In the corridors of power, however, the VVER reactors lost in competition with the RBMK, or high-power channel reactor, which used graphite to moderate the reaction and water as a coolant. The RBMK reactors had an output of 1,000 megawatts of electrical energy, twice that of the VVERs, and they were not only more powerful but also cheaper to build and operate. Whereas VVER reactors required enriched uranium, RBMK reactors were designed to run on almost natural uranium-238, with an enrichment level of a mere 2 to 3% of uranium-235. Last but not least, the RBMK reactors could be constructed on the spot from prefabricated components produced by machine-building plants that did not specialize in the production of high-precision equipment for the nuclear industry. As far as the party leadership in Moscow was concerned, it was a win-win situation. While the rest of the world chose VVER reactors, the USSR went mostly but not exclusively with the RBMK type. The Chernobyl power station was caught up in the new Soviet trend. By the time the decision was made to switch the Chernobyl reactors from VVERs to RBMKs, the latter had not yet been fully tested, but behind it stood the powerful figure of Yefim Slavsky. The director of the Igor Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, Anatoly Alexandrov, had been the scientific director for both types of reactors, and he knew their strong and weak points. But while making the claim, mentioned earlier, that the RBMK was as safe as a samovar, Alexandrov went along with the general preference for a cheaper and more powerful reactor over a safer one. The designers argued that the RBMKs were so safe that costs could be reduced even more by building them without the concrete structure that could contain radiation in the event of a reactor failure. Thus, Chernobyl got the reactors, but not the containment. There were some dissident voices, but they were silenced or ignored. The most powerful of these voices belonged to Nikolai Dolezhal, the chief designer of the RBMK. Although Dolezhal did not disown his brainchild, he considered it a mistake to build nuclear power stations in the European part of the USSR. The whole nuclear industry, in his opinion, was not safe enough for that. Dolezhal lobbied his colleagues and petitioned the government, but to no avail. He then decided to publish an article spelling out his concerns in an academic journal. The authorities offered him publication in the party's main ideological journal, Kommunist, instead. Publication there would require him to pull his punches, but the article would reach a broader audience, with the potential of inspiring a public discussion. Dolezhal took the deal. The article, titled Nuclear Energy, Achievements and Problems, which Dolezhal co-authored with a fellow scientist, U.I. Koryakin, appeared in Kommunist in the summer of 1979, a few months after the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in the United States. In March of that year, a malfunction of the cooling system led to the partial meltdown of one of the reactors and the release of radioactive gas, which led to the voluntary evacuation of close to 140,000 people from the area. Dolezhal and his co-author wrote that in the United States, the cost of building nuclear power plants had increased 7 to 8 times over because of safety concerns, a trend not followed by the Soviet nuclear industry. They were especially concerned about the quality of nuclear power equipment and safe transport of nuclear fuel and waste in the Soviet Union. With the growth in the number of nuclear energy plants, the probability of accidents would also increase, they argued. They were worried, too, about climate change as a consequence of the construction of nuclear power stations. In the Soviet Union, each plant emitted huge quantities of heat into the atmosphere. 2 or 3 units of energy for every unit turned into electric power. Dolezhal proposed that instead of building power stations in the European part of the country, as current policy dictated, nuclear stations should be located in the sparsely populated northern reaches of the USSR, close to uranium deposits. Dolezhal's article presented a huge challenge to the existing Soviet nuclear energy industry. Stations were already under construction, with billions of rubles and the reputations of leaders in the field invested in ongoing projects in the European part of the USSR, and research on long-distance transmission of electricity, which would be required if plants were built far away from populated areas, was not of high priority. According to conventional wisdom, a nuclear power plant should be a maximum of 500 to 600 kilometers from consumers. That was the logic used in choosing the site of the Chernobyl station. The Soviet academic establishment fought back. Anatoly Alexandrov published an article criticizing Dolezhal's ideas in the journal Problems of Peace and Socialism, intended for foreign, largely Eastern European audiences. Since the Soviets were building reactors abroad, he said, safety was a paramount concern, just as it was for any other Soviet technological or industrial export. Curiously enough, the Soviet-constructed plants in Eastern Europe were of the VVER type, and used water, not graphite, as a moderator of neutrons. In Ukraine, Dolezhal's concerns about building nuclear reactors in general and RBMK reactors in particular in the European part of the Soviet Union attracted the attention of the Republic's Minister of Energy, Alexei Makhukhin. His ministry, together with the All-Union Ministry of Energy and Electrification, oversaw the performance of the Chernobyl nuclear plant. Makhukhin, like most newcomers to the field of nuclear energy, was concerned about the safety of the newly constructed reactors, but he had no independent opinion on the matter. Long before the publication of Dolezhal's article, but already aware of Dolezhal's reservations, Makhukhin had asked Grigory Medvedev, then a deputy chief engineer of the Chernobyl plant, for his opinion. Medvedev responded that Dolezhal was right. The RBMK reactors were indeed dirty. "What are the projected emissions of the Chernobyl reactor?" asked the now concerned minister, according to Medvedev's memoir. "Up to 4,000 curies per 24 hours, came the answer. "And of the Novovoronezh reactor?" asked the minister, referring to a nuclear plant near Novovoronezh in central Russia employing VVER reactors. "Up to 100 curies, responded Medvedev. "A substantial difference." "But the academics, after all," responded Makhukhin. "The Council of Ministers has approved the use of the RBMK reactor. Anatoly Petrovich Alexandrov praises that reactor as the safest and most economical one. He then added, 'You're laying it on thick. No problem, we'll take care of it.'" Without the expertise and manufacturing base of Slavsky's Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the construction of the Chernobyl nuclear plant turned out to be a major challenge. The construction and plant managers, along with party officials, tended to report achievements, whereas the KGB, charged with maintaining the security of what was still considered to be secret technology and the safety of its operation, was busy pointing out design and construction flaws. Occasionally, the local KGB directorate that oversaw the safety and security of the plant served as Vasil Kizima's secret weapon, another channel through which he and his staff could alert party and state officials to problems with suppliers and lobby for their own interests. For instance, in August 1976, with the deadline for the launch of Unit 1 nearing, the Kiev Regional KGB office reported to Republican headquarters on the failure of suppliers to deliver parts and hardware, as well as on their delivery of substandard or damaged items. KGB headquarters then reported the findings of their subordinates to the party's Central Committee in Kiev. But the KGB was not only after the suppliers who failed to meet deadlines or comply with quality standards. It also targeted the shabby work done by Kizima's construction crews and Brukhanov's willingness to approve construction that was not up to industry standards. In February 1979, KGB reports about problems with the construction of Unit 2 reached KGB headquarters in Moscow, forcing none other than Yuri Andropov, the future General Secretary of the party and then head of the KGB, to report to the Central Committee about the poor quality of the work. The report held one of Kizima's deputies responsible for building the foundations of the unit without proper hydro-isolation, installing pillars that were up to 10 centimetres, almost 4 inches, off the mark, and raising walls that were 15 centimetres, almost 6 inches, off their intended location. Surprisingly, there were no accidents at the plant that could be directly attributed to construction problems. The most serious accident during this phase took place on September 9, 1982. On that day, planned repairs to reactor number 1 were completed, and the operators began bringing it back to full capacity. Everything went without a hitch until the reactor reached the power level of approximately 700 megawatts of thermal energy, MWT, more than 2/3 of the projected capacity and a dangerously unstable condition in all RBMK reactors. One of the fuel channels burst, releasing enriched uranium into the core of the reactor, and it took operators close to 30 minutes to figure out that something was wrong and shut down the reactor. According to KGB reports, the release caused the beta radiation, high-energy electrons, in contaminated areas to rise to 10 times normal levels. The commission investigating the accident concluded that the repairmen were at fault. One of them had allegedly shut the valve of the water coolant channel going to that part of the reactor, causing the fuel channel to burst. Brukhanov's second-in-command, the chief engineer of the plant, lost his job, but Brukhanov survived. After all, by industry standards, the Chernobyl plant was doing rather well, with a lower accident level than other plants of the same type. In the following year, Brukhanov was awarded the prestigious Order of the October Revolution. But problems persisted. In February 1986, as Brukhanov attended the party congress, and party leaders called for doubling the construction of nuclear units in the next 5-year period, the KGB reported on continuing difficulties at the plant, pointing to a breach of technical specifications in the construction of Unit 5. Because the vendors did not deliver the right kind of crushed stone for making concrete, the managers used the stone they had, with particles twice the size of the type that should have been used. The concrete that they poured into the forms therefore failed to get into tight spots, leaving holes in the structure. The estimated coverage area unfit for use is 300 meters, wrote the KGB officer. As Unit 5 comes into use, the technical deficiencies discovered in the production of concrete may lead to accident-threatening situations, including the possibility of human losses. There was no response to this warning. In March 1986, the All-Union Conference of Vendors, suppliers of construction materials and specialized hardware, went on for 3 days and was declared a success in Pripyat. Vasil Kizima, the head of Pripyat's construction directorate, was among the key speakers. Representatives of 28 firms that provided supplies for the construction of Unit 5 were in attendance, and only 2 enterprises failed to attend. Viktor Brukhanov was not at the meeting, but the nuclear plant was represented by his chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin. Cooperation with the construction directorate and the launching of new reactors were among his responsibilities. Fomin had become an international celebrity of sorts the previous month, when an article about the Chernobyl power station in the February issue of the English-language magazine Soviet Life quoted him as saying that the station's cooling pond was being used for breeding fish, an indication of the station's complete safety. Even if an accident happened, argued Fomin, the automatic security system would immediately shut down the reactor. Fomin never mentioned the 1982 incident at the power plant. It would have been illegal for him to do so. In the summer of 1985, censorship of information about nuclear accidents had been reinforced by an instruction from the new energy minister of the USSR, Anatoly Mayorets. Reports on adverse consequences of ecological effects on service personnel and the population, as well as of energy sources, the effect of electromagnetic fields, irradiation or pollution of the atmosphere, bodies of water or soil, on the environment are not subject to open publication in the press or in radio and television broadcasts, read the minister's instructions to the industry's personnel. At the conference, the usually active and energetic Fomin was largely silent, not because of the ministry's restrictions on speech, but because of injuries he had sustained in a car accident in late 1985. He had just returned from medical leave, and his very appearance at the conference was something of a miracle. Those in attendance could see how difficult it was for him to participate in discussions. Indeed, how hard it was for him to speak at all. Grigory Medvedev, who was no longer deputy chief engineer of the plant, but had moved to Moscow to serve in the All-Union Ministry of Energy and Electrification, attended the conference to represent the ministry. He found Fomin a shadow of his former self. Medvedev almost did not recognize his colleague, whom he had known as a healthy man with a charming smile and a pleasant voice, someone always coiled like a spring and ready to leap. There was some kind of restraint in his whole appearance, the mark of the suffering he had borne, Medvedev later recalled. He said to Fomin, "Maybe you have to take a few more months and get better. Those were pretty serious injuries." But Fomin would not listen. "Got to get on with the job," he said. Viktor Brukhanov gave Fomin all the support he could offer. "I do not think it's particularly serious," he said of Fomin's physical condition. "He's made a good recovery," he assured Medvedev. "He'll get back to normal faster by working." The party secretary of the power plant had convinced Fomin to come to work earlier than scheduled because Brukhanov was attending the party congress in Moscow, and it was up to Fomin, as second-in-command, to take charge of the plant. To Medvedev, Brukhanov himself looked overworked and tired. The director was particularly concerned about units of the power plant leaking radioactivity. Altogether, the leaks amounted to about 50 cubic meters, or 1,765 cubic feet, of radioactive water per hour coming from the drainage channels and air vents. The steam extraction units were barely able to deactivate the radioactive water. They were holding so far, but had reached the limit of their capacity. The only effective way to deal with the problem was to stop the reactors and carry out the repairs, but that would jeopardize the fulfillment of the annual plan of electricity production, and Brukhanov was not ready to face the rage of the party officials, whose main concerns were deadlines and quotas. Brukhanov told Medvedev that he was considering a move somewhere else. Thoughts of a possible job abroad that he had previously dismissed were now probably testing his resolve to stay in Pripyat. Alarm bells were going off not only in Pripyat but also in Kiev. On the day after the All-Union Conference of Vendors, Lyubov Kovalevskaya, the Tribuna Energetika reporter, managed to publish a version of her earlier article about problems with the construction of Unit 5 in the Kiev newspaper Literaturna Ukraina, Literary Ukraine, the mouthpiece of the Ukrainian Union of Writers. Much of it was taken verbatim from her Russian-language article in Tribuna Energetika and translated into Ukrainian. But the article in Literaturna Ukraina was addressed to a wider audience, and also made points of more general significance. While observing the obligatory idealization of Soviet socialism and praising the party for its accomplishments and concern about the Soviet people, Kovalevskaya listed arresting examples of the problems faced by construction crews at the Chernobyl power station. According to her, out of 45,500 cubic meters of prefabricated concrete that the Construction Directorate had ordered in 1985, 3,200 cubic meters of concrete never arrived, and 6,000 cubic meters of concrete turned out to be defective. Also defective were 326 tons of sealant for the nuclear waste depository and 220 tons of columns for the turbine hall of the reactor under construction. Kovalevskaya allowed herself to criticize not only the vendors who had failed to deliver parts and hardware on time, but also her own construction directorate, the owner of the newspaper she worked for. Disorganization weakened not only discipline, but also the responsibility of each and all for the results of joint efforts, wrote Kovalevskaya. The impossibility or even incapacity of engineering and technical personnel to organize the work of brigades weakened standards. Exhaustion, the deterioration of equipment, machines and mechanisms, the lack of mechanical implements and tools, and the like, all made themselves apparent. In a word, all the shortcomings, typical, alas, of the construction mechanism, manifested themselves in aggravated form, and the time coincided with the start of economic restructuring, which, as is well known, requires first and foremost the restructuring of human consciousness. Kovalevskaya waited for a reaction to her article, but there was none, either from Pripyat or from Kiev. As far as the Pripyat party officials were concerned, Kovalevskaya's style of investigative journalism and record of uncovering abuses by senior officials had long marked her as a troublemaker. Rumour had it that the bosses were preparing to expel her from the party, which would make it all but impossible for her to continue her journalistic career. For the time being, however, no one seemed to care. The world media would not discover the article and its author until a month later, after April the 26th, 1986.